The courtroom was already crowded, a low hum of voices bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. At the defense table stood a young black woman, her suit pressed, her back straight, her notes arranged with careful precision. She wasn't there as a defendant. She wasn't there as a spectator. She was the advocate, the voice of a client accused of something small, almost trivial, a traffic violation that had somehow escalated into a full court hearing. Her voice, carried with calm authority, steady as she cross-examined an officer on the stand. Every word was deliberate, each question crafted to expose gaps in the testimony. For her, this was more than routine litigation. It was a fight against a system that always seemed to cast her and her client in the role of intruders rather than participants. Near the prosecution's table, another officer leaned back in his chair. He wasn't part of the case, just assigned to courtroom security, but his presence carried weight. His arms were folded, his lips curled into a smirk, and then, low enough not to be caught on the record, but clear enough for her to hear, came the sting. A word, muttered casually, ugly. In its familiarity, it was meant for her alone. She faltered, just for a breath. Not long enough for the gallery to notice, but enough that the insult landed where he wanted it to. Beneath the surface, in the space where composure battles fury. She steadied herself, forced her eyes back to her notes, and pressed on with her questioning. But the echo of that word lingered. Her client shifted uneasily, sensing the shift in her tone even if he hadn't heard the insult. A few members of the gallery had caught it, too. Their eyes darted between the officer and the young lawyer, waiting to see if she would respond. She glanced toward the bench. The presiding judge, an older white man with thinning hair, hadn't missed it. She could tell by the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the pause in his pen as he pretended to scribble notes. He heard. He knew. And yet he did nothing. His silence, like the officer's insult, was an act of power. It wasn't just a personal attack. It was professional diminishment, a reminder that in this space, a courtroom where justice was meant to be blind, she was not only seen but judged. Her years of study, her credentials, her preparation meant less than the color of her skin and the firmness of her voice. She stood taller, refusing to let the insult dictate the rhythm of her argument. But the message had been delivered, even here, inside the supposed sanctuary of justice. Her legitimacy was fragile in the eyes of those who wielded authority. How many times have dignity and competence been erased with one word, one look, one silence? The camera of attention shifts from the lawyer's clenched jaw to the officer's smirk, then to the judge's still face, exposing the quiet complicity that sustains disrespect. For the audience, the tension is not only in the insult, but in the silence that follows it. Silence from the bench. Silence from those who know better. Silence that confirms how easily injustice survives when authority chooses to look away. The lawyer pressed on, her questions sharp, her voice unwavering. But the sting remained, layered beneath every word. If you've ever seen power abused in plain sight, drop a justice in the comments. The insult that morning in court was not just a stray act of disrespect. It was a reminder of a deeper truth, that for Black women, every professional step forward comes with an added weight. She was not only dismissed as a lawyer but reduced as a woman and as Black, both identities colliding to create a barrier that was uniquely her own. This collision is what legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw named intersectionality. It describes how multiple forms of bias do not simply stack, but instead create a distinct form of discrimination that cannot be understood by looking at race or gender alone. A Black woman lawyer is not just navigating the stereotypes faced by her male counterparts, nor only the barriers faced by white women. She faces a blend of both, compounded and sharpened into something that makes her path lonelier, steeper, and more contested. Numbers tell part of the story. As of 2022, Black women represented less than 1% of law firm partners nationwide. In federal courts, they make up only about 3% of sitting judges. That means that in many legal chambers across the country, no Black woman is present at all, either to argue cases or to interpret the law from the bench. When she stood in that courtroom and faced silence from the judge, it was not only one man's choice to ignore disrespect. It was the reflection of a broader pattern. Institutions still reluctant to treat Black women as rightful holders of authority. History provides sharp examples. Constance Baker Motley, a brilliant lawyer who would go on to become the first black woman appointed to the federal judiciary, recalled how judges once turned their backs when she argued cases. They did not want to look at her as she spoke. Some lawyers even tried to convince courts that she was unqualified, despite her record of victories. Their tactics were meant to do exactly what the officer's insult had done in that courtroom, to make her feel like she did not belong. Motley never let those tactics define her. She pressed on, but the indignities she endured make clear that the bias was not accidental. It was deliberate exclusion. That exclusion takes many forms today. Scholars describe something called the inclusion tax, the extra energy and resources Black women must spend simply to be accepted in spaces that were not built with them in mind. From navigating biased evaluations to shaping their appearance in ways that conform to white professional standards, Black women pay a tax on their time and energy just to stand in the same room as their peers. Even in the process of selecting judges, the American Bar Association has been shown to give higher ratings to white men, reinforcing barriers to advancement. This is why the humiliation in that courtroom mattered. It was not a single insult that could be brushed aside. It was an expression of a much larger system that has consistently demanded more from Black women while giving them less recognition in return. Her straight posture and steady tone that morning were not simply habits of professionalism. They were a shield against a culture that constantly questioned whether she belonged in the room at all. What she endured links her directly to those who came before her. Like Motley, she knew that silence from authority figures can wound as much as open hostility. The judge's refusal to intervene told her that in this space, her standing could be undermined at any moment, no matter her preparation or credentials. That is the double burden. Racism on one side, sexism on the other, squeezing her from both directions until even success feels precarious. The deeper tragedy is that none of this is hidden. It is documented in numbers and in stories across decades. Yet each time, Black women have carried themselves forward, knowing they have to work harder, speak clearer, and move sharper to be taken seriously. You know someone who had to work twice as hard just to be taken half as seriously? Share their story below. The sting of that insult in court could have left her isolated, as though she alone bore the weight of humiliation. Yet her story is part of something much older, a chain of battles fought by women who came before her, each one forced to endure disrespect, each one determined to break barriers despite it. The lineage begins in 1872 with Charlotte E. Ray, the first Black woman to graduate from an American law school. Armed with her degree from Howard University, she sought to build a career in Washington, D.C. But clients rarely came. Many refused to trust a woman. Even fewer trusted a Black woman. Though her practice struggled, her achievement was itself a defiant act in an era when society insisted women of her race should have no place in the law. Her attempt to carve a space for herself became the foundation on which others would later stand. Decades later, in 1939, Jane Bolin carried that legacy forward when she became the first Black woman judge in the United States. Even before her appointment, her years at Yale Law School were marked by isolation. She was one of only 3 women in her class and the only Black woman. Southern classmates would let doors close in her face as she approached. Professors often refused to call on her during discussions, pretending she wasn't there. The message was clear. She might be in the room, but she was never meant to be recognized. When she finally took her seat on the bench, her presence alone was revolutionary. Yet, even in that position, she understood the hostility that surrounded her. She presided not only over cases, but over the daily reminder that her very existence disrupted centuries of exclusion. Each ruling she made was a rebuttal to the slights she had endured, proof that the doors others slammed shut could not keep her from reshaping the profession. By the mid-20th century, Constance Baker Motley carried this struggle into courtrooms across the country. Her skill was unmatched. She argued and won 9 out of 10 cases before the United States Supreme Court. She was part of the legal team that dismantled school segregation, forcing universities to admit Black students in the face of violent opposition. Yet her brilliance did not shield her from indignity. Judges sometimes refused to look at her as she spoke, turning their backs during her arguments. Male lawyers whispered that she was unfit to stand before the bench, hoping to discredit her. in front of clients and colleagues. The threats she faced outside the courtroom were even more chilling. When she traveled to the South to argue civil rights cases, she often had to stay in private homes because hotels would not welcome her. At night, armed guards kept watch, but even then sleep came only lightly, interrupted by the fear of what might come. Her courage was not only in her legal victories, but in her persistence in the face of a profession designed to shut her out. She later recalled that her opponents' tactics were aimed less at discrediting her legal arguments than at undermining her humanity. They wanted her to feel she did not belong, the same tactic the officer had deployed in the present-day courtroom with a muttered insult. The young lawyer who stood before the bench that morning, holding her posture despite humiliation, was inheriting this legacy. She was not the first to be diminished in a courtroom, not the first to be ignored, dismissed, or openly mocked. She stood on ground paved by women who had faced far worse and yet persisted. Their stories remind us that disrespect is not a series of accidents. It is structural. It is the quiet language of a system that has long sought to keep certain people in their place. And yet, from Ray to Boland to Motley, each step forward was carved out of resistance. To see her hold her ground in that crowded courtroom is to see the echoes of their resilience. The insult was meant to shrink her, but instead it tied her to a history of strength that stretches across generations. The hearing pressed on, but the atmosphere inside the courtroom had shifted. The young lawyer had steadied her voice, sharpened her questions, and continued defending her client with practiced clarity. Yet the officer who had insulted her earlier had not finished his performance. From his seat near the prosecution's table, his smirk returned, brazen now, a silent declaration that he could do it again and still face no consequence. That it was not only his expression. His body leaned casually in the chair, his boots stretched out as though the proceedings themselves were beneath him. Every gesture was crafted to undercut her presence, to signal to the room that her authority was fragile. The judge finally looked up. Instead of addressing the officer's behavior, he chose to focus on her. His tone was measured, but his words cut deeply. "Counselor, are you certain you're prepared for this case? Perhaps you'd like to step aside so someone with more experience can take over." The question landed heavier than the insult. It was now recorded in the official transcript, cemented in ink for anyone to read. The implication was clear. Not only did the officer treat her as less than, but the presiding authority of the court questioned whether she belonged there at all. A hush fell across the gallery. Even those who had dismissed the earlier insult now recognized the moment for what it was: complicity given voice. She gripped the edge of the defense table, the smooth wood grounding her as she forced her breathing into rhythm. Dignity over despair. She had fought too hard to reach this point to let the smirk of an officer and the skepticism of a judge strip her of her voice. When she spoke again, her tone was firmer, her phrasing deliberate. "Your Honor, I am fully prepared to proceed. My client deserves a fair hearing, and I intend to provide nothing less." The judge shifted in his chair, unwilling to admit fault, unwilling to acknowledge the insult he had overlooked or the doubt he had cast. Her refusal to bend was an act of defiance, quiet but powerful. It was also dangerous. For Black women in professional spaces, dignity often comes at a higher cost. Studies show that in encounters with law enforcement, Black individuals are 61% more likely to hear disrespectful remarks than white individuals in the same circumstances. Disdain directed at them is not rare. It is embedded in daily interactions. What unfolded in that courtroom was not unusual. It was a reflection of a national pattern. Disrespect normalized, authority unchecked, silence from those who could intervene. The young lawyer stood in that lineage of indignity, but also in the lineage of resistance. Her voice, though calm, carried more weight now because it pressed against not just one officer or one judge, but a culture that had always doubted her worth. The smirk at the prosecution's table faltered, just slightly. Perhaps it was her steadiness. Perhaps the subtle murmur from the gallery. But for the first time, the officer's confidence cracked. Still, the moment lingered as a reminder. The structures of authority had chosen sides, and those sides were not hers. Yet her presence, her refusal to step aside, had already shifted the balance in a way that could not be erased. Would you have stayed silent or spoken up? What would you have done in her shoes? But this humiliation would not define her story. The memory of that smirk, The sting of the insult and the judge's public doubt could have marked the end for someone less resolute. Instead, she turned those moments into fuel. Every slight, every dismissal, every silence hardened her resolve to prove not just that she belonged, but that she could excel in the very spaces designed to push her out. The years that followed brought growth. She took on cases that others overlooked, cases that seemed unwinnable or too politically charged. Yet her preparation was meticulous, her arguments sharp, her presence commanding. Slowly, judges who once dismissed her began to recognize her skill. Attorneys who whispered about her competence learned to brace themselves when they saw her name. On opposing briefs, her reputation spread, not just a lawyer who fought, but one who fought with precision. Her career began to mirror the journey of Constance Baker Motley, the towering figure who had also endured insult and exclusion only to rise into prominence. Motley had been central to the legal team that dismantled school segregation. She helped craft arguments in Brown versus Board of Education, a ruling that shook the foundation of Jim Crow America. Later, she led the charge to desegregate the University of Mississippi, a battle so fierce it required federal troops to escort James Meredith through mobs of resistance. Motley knew danger intimately, yet she carried herself with the same steadiness that defined her brilliance in court. The young lawyer's own victories, while not inscribed in history books, echoed that same spirit. She won appellate cases that set precedent in her district. She exposed flaws in prosecutions that had relied on shaky police testimony. She challenged discriminatory practices within her profession, often standing alone, armed with her legal training and a refusal to bow. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. The dim courtroom where she had once been insulted gave way to brighter chambers, walls lined with books she had mastered, certificates of hard-earned recognition mounted in neat rows. Her voice, once ignored or mocked, now carried authority that filled the air. Her posture, once a shield against humiliation, became a symbol of confidence. Colleagues began turning to her for guidance. Young attorneys, especially young Black women, sought her mentorship, seeing in her what they had been told was impossible. It was not that the disrespect disappeared. Even as her reputation grew, subtle slights and questions lingered, yet she met them differently. Each remark that once threatened to cut her down now only highlighted the progress she had made. The higher she rose, the clearer it became that her journey was not an individual triumph, but part of a collective fight. Motley herself had described her own determination as a refusal to be put down. That phrase became a quiet mantra for the new generation, including this lawyer who had tasted the sting of disrespect firsthand. Like Motley, she understood that the struggle was bigger than her name on a case file. Every victory chipped away at structures meant to deny her place. Every success signaled to others that persistence could overcome exclusion, even if the fight was relentless. There was pride in this shift. The woman once mocked in open court now commanded rooms that once ignored her. The insult that had nearly silenced her became the backdrop to a career that demanded recognition. She refused erasure. Her story was no longer about humiliation. It was about transformation. The same courtroom that sought to belittle her became the proving ground where her resilience was forged. And in the glow of her new chambers, with her voice steady and her presence unshakable, she embodied a truth larger than her own journey. That dignity, once defended, can rise higher than any attempt to deny it. Years passed, and the same courthouse that once tried to diminish her now carried her name on its docket. She no longer approached its doors as an anxious advocate waiting to be recognized. She entered through the private chamber reserved for judges, robe draped across her arm, gavel in hand. The courtroom that once tolerated her humiliation now paused when she stepped inside. All rise. The command carried through the room, and everyone obeyed. Officers, clerks, attorneys, even the kind of judges who had once smirked at her presence. The same gesture that had once been denied her, respect, was now compulsory. She had not only claimed her place in the system, she now presided over it. The transformation was striking. Years earlier, her words had been interrupted, her qualifications questioned, her authority mocked. Now her seat was elevated above the courtroom. The bench itself a physical reminder of the authority she carried. Where she once gripped the defense table to steady her hands, she now held a gavel, its weight symbolic of the power to command silence, to shape the record, to decide. Her eyes scanned the room, landing for a moment on a young lawyer, another black woman standing at the defense table. She saw the nerves in her hands, the tension in her posture. The sight reminded her of that morning long ago, when she too had stood exposed to insult and complicity. The difference now was clear. Someone like her was no longer just pleading for recognition. Someone like her was the law in this room. Her rise reflected more than personal determination. It was part of a broader shift taking root across the country. For decades, black women had been pushed to the margins of the judiciary. As recently as 2020, fewer than 10% of federal judges were black, and fewer than 5% were women of color. But by 2024, progress had accelerated. President Biden had appointed more black women to the federal appellate bench than all previous presidents combined. For the first time in history, a black woman, Ketanji Brown Jackson, sat on the United States Supreme Court, a living testament to battles waged across generations. These changes did not erase the disparities. Black women still accounted for only about 3% of sitting federal judges, far below their share of the population. Yet the cracks in the wall of exclusion were undeniable. Her very presence on the bench was both a personal victory and a collective one, proof that the structures designed to hold her back could no longer fully succeed. The symbolism of this reversal could not be ignored. Years earlier, an officer's smirk and a judge's silence had sought to define her as lesser. Now the same roles were reversed. It was the officers who shifted uneasily under her gaze. It was the attorneys who scrambled to maintain composure when questioned. The authority of the courtroom no longer dismissed her. It radiated from her. This shift was not fantasy. It was earned. Every late night preparing briefs, every insult absorbed without breaking, every ruling defended with clarity had paved the way. Where she once endured dismissal, she now set precedent. Where she once was told to step aside, she now decided who would speak and when. For those watching, especially for young women of color stepping into courtrooms for the first time, the image was powerful. The system had tried to silence her, but now it had to listen. The courtroom had once been the site of her humiliation. Now it was the site of her authority. The reversal was complete, but it was not the end of the struggle. It was proof of what could be achieved, a reminder that dignity defended can grow into power recognized. Her gavel struck against the bench, calling the court to order. The sound echoed with more than authority. It carried history, resilience, and the weight of justice. On her own terms, her presence on the bench was a milestone, but it was not the conclusion of her fight. Authority had given her a louder voice, but it also demanded that she use it to address the very injustices that once sought to silence her. From the elevated seat she now held, she carried a responsibility larger than her own redemption. In case after case, she made it clear that her role was not ceremonial. She took on issues that cut to the core of equity and access. In one landmark ruling, she upheld the rights of female sports reporters to enter locker rooms for post-game interviews, declaring that equal access could not be reserved for men alone. In another, she recognized the constitutional violations endured by incarcerated individuals, ruling against prison officials who had denied basic human rights to black inmates. Each decision extended her influence beyond the courtroom, setting standards that reshaped professional and civic spaces. These rulings carried echoes of Constance Baker Motley, who had used her own judicial seat to widen opportunities for those long excluded. Motley had ruled in favor of women's rights, labor protections, and racial equality, recognizing that her bench was not a retreat from activism, but a continuation of it in another form. The new judge followed that same path. Every case, she decided, reminded observers that the judiciary was not neutral terrain. It could either reinforce barriers or dismantle them. She chose the latter. Still, her victories did not erase the larger disparities she confronted daily. For every judgment she delivered, countless others across the nation still came from benches where diversity was absent. The judiciary remained a landscape where women of color were rare, and their decisions were often scrutinized with more suspicion than those of their peers. She knew her position was fragile, not guaranteed to the next generation unless the pipeline widened. This awareness shaped the way she carried herself beyond the courtroom. She spoke at law schools, mentoring young attorneys who doubted whether their place in the profession could be secured. She met with community groups to explain how the law could be used as a shield rather than only as a weapon. She worked to ensure that her chambers became a training ground where clerks and interns from marginalized backgrounds gained the experience that could propel them into positions long closed to them. What made her impact profound was that it was never only about her. Her journey from humiliation to authority could have ended in personal satisfaction, but she refused to let it stop there. Each decision, each mentorship, each ruling was designed to ripple outward, touching lives she would never meet, but whose futures would be shaped by the pathways she cleared. The reminder was constant. Personal triumph does not dismantle systems. Yet personal triumph can expose cracks in those systems, openings through which others can push. Her presence on the bench created one such crack. Her rulings widened it. Her mentorship turned it into a path. In her, resilience and justice met. She was no longer just the woman who had endured an officer's insult and a judge's complicity. She became a symbol of what persistence can achieve and how authority can be wielded for those without it. She was not only presiding over cases, she was safeguarding dignity itself. Her journey was not only about one woman's determination. It was about a tradition of resilience that stretches across generations, carried by those who refuse to be silenced. In the face of insults, erasure, and exclusion, she chose to rise. And in doing so, she joined a lineage that redefines what justice can look like. This resilience carries another name: Black joy. Not a denial of pain, but a refusal to let that pain consume the spirit. Black joy insists on dignity in spaces that deny it. It celebrates achievement without pretending the struggle has disappeared. For her, every step onto the bench, every strike of the gavel, every young lawyer she mentored was an act of joy, a declaration that she would not be put down. Progress is visible, though incomplete. More Black women than ever before now sit on federal benches. The appointment of Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court signaled a milestone that would have been unthinkable in earlier decades. Under the current administration, more Black women have been nominated and confirmed to appellate courts than under all previous presidents combined. And yet, even with these gains, the numbers remain stark. Only a small fraction of judges nationwide are Black women, and many courts across the country still have none at all. Her story reflects both truths at once: how far the fight has come and how much further it must go. Each achievement is both a victory and a reminder that the work of justice is unfinished. Her authority on the bench does not erase the insult she once endured, nor the countless others faced by women like her every day. What it does offer is proof that dignity can survive, grow, and reshape the very systems that once denied it. The courtroom that once tried to silence her now echoes with her gavel. Her story is not just hers, it's ours. If this story inspired you, hit subscribe, because Echoes of Black is where these stories live and where our voices will never be silenced.